Dawn on June 22, 1941, 3 German army groups and their allies crossed a 1,800-mile front into the Soviet Union. The invasion force was the largest Europe had ever seen. More than 3.8 million Axis troops, roughly 3,350 to 3,800 tanks and assault guns, thousands of aircraft, and a logistics tail that included some 600,000 horses pulling guns and wagons. The objective sounded simple on paper: smash the Red Army at the border, race to a line from Arkhangelsk to Astrakhan, and force the Soviet state to collapse, because in Berlin many believed it would. That confidence came from recent history. In 1939 and 1940, German armor and air power had torn through Poland and then France with terrifying speed. The term blitzkrieg became shorthand for a way of war that joined radios, tanks, dive bombers, and flexible command into a tempo opponents couldn't match. Inside the Wehrmacht, success hardened into assumption. The next enemy, whoever it was, would break the same way if hit hard enough at the start. Imperial War Museums. Before Barbarossa, German leaders judged the Soviet Union through ideology as much as intelligence. Hitler told his generals in July 1940 that defeating the USSR would end British hopes and clear Germany's path. The premise rested on a picture of Soviet power as brittle, Asiatic, mismanaged, and backward. Propaganda hammered the idea of a peasant army led by political commissars rather than professionals, with obsolete machines and no initiative. Those assumptions bled into planning estimates. Few in the German high command thought they were walking into an industrial giant that could absorb catastrophe and keep fighting. Even the armored force that rolled east reflected that mindset. German Panzer divisions in June 1941 were not wall-to-wall heavy tanks. They were a balance tool built for speed and exploitation. Many battalions still fielded light Panzer IIs, a large share of Czech-built Panzer 38Ts, and medium Panzer IIIs with 50mm guns alongside Panzer IVs armed with the short-barreled 75mm, adequate against what Berlin thought the Soviets had, especially in the first weeks when encircled foes were expected to surrender or be destroyed piecemeal. Across 17 panzer divisions, average on-hand strength ran around 190 tanks each, with variation by unit and theater. Intelligence about Soviet armor was incomplete and dated. German analysts catalogued large numbers of interwar T-26 and BT series tanks and assumed those would make up the decisive mass. Modern designs existed in Red Army brochures and rumors, but no one in the West had fought them. The shock that was coming: a fast, hard-hitting medium tank with sloped armor, T-34, and a truly heavy tank that shrugged off early German anti-tank guns, KV-1/KV-2, simply wasn't built into German expectations for the opening battles. Berlin would not seriously process that reality until reports from the front forced it. The opening days seemed to validate the plan. Army Group North blazed through the Baltics toward Leningrad. Army Group Center smashed Western Front armies around Białystok, Minsk. Army Group South drove into Ukraine toward Kiev. Luftwaffe strikes wrecked Red Air Force airfields. By any normal measure, the gains were immense. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners, destroyed headquarters, rail junctions captured. The invaders believed they were watching a house of cards collapse just as predicted. Yet the scale of the Soviet state, its depth, manpower, and stubborn ability to raise new formations, wasn't a card trick. Within weeks, the chief of the German General Staff, Franz Halder, was writing in his war diary that the Russian Colossus has been underestimated by us, a sober admission after the first chest-beating communiqué. Numbers mattered. The Red Army put far more men and materiel into the field than Berlin expected, even after losing whole armies in the border battles. German logistics, meanwhile, were straining. Much of the force still depended on horses for haulage, and the road net east of the border was poor. Broad-gauge Soviet railways had to be converted quickly to move ammunition and fuel forward. Every mile, the Panzer spearheads advanced, widened the gap between front-line consumption and what trucks and rail could deliver. Luftwaffe crews flew themselves ragged to keep pressure on retreating Soviet units, but they could not replace broken supply math or the loss rates on worn-out vehicles. By late summer, the distance alone and the ferocity of Soviet counterthrusts had slowed the Blitz. Inside the Panzer Force, company and battalion commanders were hearing new, unsettling reports from their forward elements. Anti-tank rifle teams found their 7.92 mm rounds useless against certain Soviet hulls. Crews reported ricochets off oddly angled armor. Field guns hurried forward to act as door knockers at short range. At first, such messages were filed as anomalies or chalked up to poor gunnery under stress. The institutional bias, they are peasants with obsolete machines, was strong enough to filter unpleasant news. That would change in July, when contact reports around Minsk and Smolensk named what the Germans were seeing. They had not trained for the T-34 or the KV family. The hubris wasn't limited to weapons. Many German planners believed the Soviet system would implode politically once hammered hard at the front. Purges of the officer corps in the late 1930s and early war disasters fed that belief. Instead, the state tightened. Commanders who failed were shot or demoted. Others learned. Improvised defenses formed along rivers and around cities. New armies appeared as if from nowhere, and the Soviets proved willing to trade space for time on a continental scale. Halder's diary line: "Whenever a dozen divisions are destroyed, the Russians replace them with another dozen," captures the sickening realization inside the German staff that they were in a different kind of war than the one they had won in France. All of this sits behind the simple headline for our story. German generals laughed at Soviet peasants, then met a machine and an industrial society built for the very fight they had chosen. In June 1941, the Wehrmacht had the initiative, a fearsome combined arms doctrine, and units that had learned how to win fast. It also carried an enemy picture shaped by racism and victory bias, and that picture blinded smart men to what was rolling toward them. Barbarossa's opening was the high watermark of that confidence. The months that followed would expose how wrong those assumptions were, one battlefield report at a time, and nothing changed minds faster than the first hard metallic evidence on the front. Shells bouncing where they were supposed to penetrate. That is where we pick up next. The first shock. Reports from Army Group Center of unknown heavy tanks near Minsk, panzer crews firing point blank and watching rounds slide away. The dawning understanding that German anti-tank rifles were useless and field guns had to be dragged forward under fire. The T-34 and K-5 had arrived, and the war Germans thought they were fighting changed in a single contact. As the German spearheads advanced deeper into Soviet territory, new dispatches began to arrive. In late June and early July 1941, forward panzer units operating around Minsk and Smolensk radioed in descriptions that startled the command. Unknown heavy tank. Armor sloped. Gunfire ineffective. Some wrote of German shells bouncing clean off hulls. Others described enemy tanks advancing shoulder to shoulder with infantry, shrugging off hits that should have disabled them. These reports were initially treated as exaggeration, misidentification, or propaganda noise, but they converged too often to ignore. Heinz Guderian, writing in his diary from Panzergruppe II headquarters, noted with growing disquiet that his divisional reports kept returning marked Unbekanntes Modell, unknown model. In one entry from early July, he recorded, "A tank attacked our left flank. None of our 37mm rounds penetrated. Its tracking stayed steady. We withdrew after 500 meters." At the time, that entry was buried beneath operational dispatches, but later historians lifted it as one of the first German acknowledgments that Soviet armor might be more advanced than anticipated. German staff reports forwarded these to Army Group Center with the caveat, "Investigate further." Guderian diary editions. Officers in forward units tried adjustments. Anti-tank rifle teams, carrying the Panzerbuchse 38 and 39, armed with tungsten rounds, shifted angles, closed ranges to under 300 meters, aimed for tracks or vision slits. Still, they failed. In the forests of northeastern Belarus, crews reported having to disable new T-34s by mobility kills, destroyed road wheels or tracks, rather than penetrating the hull. Some Soviet tanks simply kept going, dragging broken track plates behind, soldiers abandoning them after retreat, but leaving them driving forward. One battalion commander in Panzer Brigade 31 recorded, "We hit it 50 times with everything we had. It still drove over a field and out of sight." Engineers examined captured rounds and fragments. When artillery units were pulled forward to act as anti-tank guns, 150mm howitzers and 105mm guns, they found that direct fire shots sometimes crumpled gearboxes or engine couplings instead of punching holes. The high trajectory, thin armor, and sloping plates of the T-34, 45mm thickness angled at around 60 degrees, produced effective resistance to face-on fire. The KV-1 heavy tanks with 75 to 90mm armor were virtually impervious. In the command nets, replayed radio intercepts and wire intercept transcripts, Ultra and Abwehr, passed messages, "New Russian tanks moving south." Some Soviet signals indicated deployment of the 7th and 34th Tank Divisions into the Minsk sector, with numbers of T-34s among them. German reconnaissance films later confirmed lost Soviet tanks with designs matching T-34 silhouettes, turret rounded, long hull lines, angled tracks. Field engineers matched photographs with captured enemy drawings. Clear evidence mounted that the German war plan had failed to reckon with these machines. The shock was both technical and psychological. Panzer crews experienced defeat in microcosm. The weapon they trusted refused to function. The enemy they despised proved unexpectedly resilient. The doctrine of breakthrough was meant to work against lighter, brittle armor. It faltered when meeting a tank combining protection, mobility, and firepower. Some junior officers questioned their commanding doctrine. Others asked whether logistical assumptions, fuel, ammunition, forward supply, were bankrupting their advance faster than Soviet resistance. Back in Berlin and at Army High Command, staff officers delayed admitting the scope of the problem. Reports came from unit intelligence. One T-34 observed supporting infantry on a forested flank, possibly in battalion strength. Still, many senior planners believed that Soviet models were few and unlikely to appear in mass until mid to late 1941. They assumed German technical superiority would ultimately prevail. Hitler's directives for rapid decisive movement left little room for systematic study or redesign. Meanwhile, Soviet armored corps began coordinating new tactics. T-34s moved in platoons with motorized rifle support, using forest cover and rail sidings for surprise. Some used maskirovka, camouflage and false movement, to ambush Schneider positions. As German Panzer formations outran support, T-34 counterattacks from the flank struck fuel trucks, supply columns, and exposed tracks. In the Battle of Białystok-Minsk, German mechanized infantry columns were split, and advancing panzers found enemy medium tanks crossing into their rear guard lines. The speed of Soviet counteraction confounded German expectations of passive resistance in the rear. In the weeks following first contact, German technical staff scrambled patches. They modified protruding parts, added appliqué steel skirts, Schürzen, on Panzer IIIs and IVs, ordered ammunition with higher velocity, and experimented with new penetrator rounds. But those were stopgaps. Production could not catch the sudden demand curve. The doctrinal delay, time lost to investigations, circular memos, pilot modifications, cost German panzers dearly in July and August 1941. By early August, Army Group Center logs showed mounting losses, broken tanks, burned-out hulks, disabled engines, crews walking. Morale in panzer divisions flagged. The assumption of dominance cracked. In diaries from Hitler's inner staff, some Hitler confidants wrote of Russian monsters and wondered whether the blitz to Moscow was ill-timed. The first shock had become strategic reality. The Germans had met armored machines they had no method to defeat at scale. The myth of the peasant tank, safe to ignore and dismiss, shattered under the impact of steel and trajectory. What Germans had laughed off as backward Soviet designs now forced doctrinal revisions, hardware adaptation, and a race in tank engineering. In the crucible of 1941, the T-34 and KV series revealed themselves not as statistical anomalies, but as foils for the German armored empire's hubris. When German tank crews first faced the T-34 in 1941, what they met wasn't simply another armored vehicle. It was a machine that rewrote the rules of tank warfare. Every major advantage Germany had relied on since Poland and France, speed, shock, and technical dominance, collapsed in front of a design that the Wehrmacht hadn't anticipated and couldn't easily counter. The T-34's success began with a single idea that most Western engineers had ignored: geometry. The Soviet designers at the Kharkov locomotive plant, led by Mikhail Koshkin and Alexander Morozov, angled the armor. Instead of relying on thickness, they sloped the plates to deflect shells. The result was 45 millimeters of armor that acted like 60 or 70 millimeters in combat. German shells from the 37 millimeter Pak-36 and even early 50 millimeter guns bounced away at standard engagement ranges. When test firing against a captured T-34 in August 1941, German engineers discovered that no shell under 500 meters per second could penetrate its front plate. That single realization forced an entire generation of re-engineering in German tank design. The Soviets had combined that protection with mobility. Instead of gasoline engines that burst into flame when hit, the T-34 used a 12-cylinder V2 diesel engine, producing 500 horsepower. It gave the tank a top road speed of roughly 30 miles per hour, about 48 kilometers per hour, and a cruising range near 300 kilometers, numbers the Panzer III and IV could not match. Diesel fuel was safer, cheaper, and easier to produce inside the Soviet wartime economy. Then there were the tracks. The T-34's wide 50-centimeter treads spread its 26-ton weight evenly, allowing it to cross mud and snow that stopped every German vehicle. The Wehrmacht soon learned that General Mud, which had bogged down Napoleon, was now fighting for the Soviets. German tanks equipped with narrow tracks sank into the thaw. The T-34 glided over it. In the autumn of 1941, near Mtsensk and Bryansk, Soviet tank brigades under Colonel Katukov repeatedly used forest paths and swampy fields to outflank panzer columns whose heavier tanks couldn't follow. The tank's gun made the difference on the battlefield. The 76.2 mm F-34 gun could penetrate any German tank in 1941, while its high explosive shells were effective against infantry and fortifications. German Panzer III crews, most of whom carried only short-barreled 50 mm KWK-38s, found themselves outranged by more than half a kilometer. At Smolensk, Soviet tankers firing from tree lines disabled panzer platoons before German gunners could even acquire a target. Just as important as performance was production philosophy. The T-34 was not designed for perfection. It was designed for quantity. Before the war, the Soviets had already decentralized manufacturing into multiple factories: Kharkov, Stalingrad, and later Nizhny Tagil and Chelyabinsk. When the Germans invaded, the entire production base was moved east behind the Urals. Operation Barbarossa reached the Dnieper. The Soviet industrial heart reassembled beyond it. Between 1941 and 1942, more than 1,500 factories were dismantled, loaded onto rail cars, and re-established in the east. T-34 production resumed within months of relocation. At the new Ural tank plant, number 183, assembly lines simplified the design to cut build time from 8,000 labor hours per unit in 1941 to 3,500 by 1943. Early tanks showed rough welds and exposed seams, but they worked, and could be produced at 10 times the rate of any German equivalent. Where a Panther required about 150,000 labor hours and precision components, a T-34 rolled off the line in less than a week of work time. By 1942, the Soviets were producing nearly 24,000 tanks per year, roughly 4 times the German total. The T-34's construction also fit Soviet resources. Its armor used medium-hard steel alloyed with less nickel and chromium, both scarce in wartime. Its Christie suspension system, adapted from American designs bought in the 1930s, allowed higher speed and easier maintenance. Crews could replace a damaged road wheel in the field without workshop equipment. Inside, the layout was cramped and ergonomically poor, but for Soviet doctrine, mass attacks, short-range engagements, it was adequate. Captured examples gave German designers a blueprint for imitation. In 1942, engineers at MAN and Daimler-Benz examined a damaged T-34 at Kummersdorf and concluded that the design represents the optimal balance between firepower, armor, and mobility. Their subsequent project, the Panther, W5, copied the sloped armor, wide tracks, and 75 mm high-velocity gun concept almost directly. But the Panther's complexity, 2,000 parts compared to about 1,500 in a T-34, meant it could never be built fast enough. On the battlefield, this design parity came too late. By the time the Panther debuted at Kursk in 1943, more than 30,000 T-34s were already in service. The German army was forced to fight a tank it had once mocked, on ground it no longer controlled, against an enemy that could replace losses faster than they could be inflicted. Every feature of the T-34, sloped armor, diesel power, wide tracks, simple construction, was not just engineering brilliance, but a reflection of Soviet strategy. It was the first modern total war tank, conceived not as an elite weapon, but as a tool that the entire nation could build and field. It made technical sense, logistical sense, and psychological sense, a machine built to match the endurance of the people who drove it. In 1941, German officers wrote in their situation reports that the new Russian tank, with thick slanted armor and 76mm gun was appearing in greater numbers each week. That line, buried in typewritten dispatches, marked the end of an era. The Wehrmacht's myth of superiority had met a machine that embodied the opposite of its ideology: efficiency over extravagance, simplicity over precision, resilience over pride. The T-34's creation was not an accident. It was the outcome of Soviet engineering under siege, built by men and women who expected no comfort and aimed for survival. In design rooms under blackout curtains, they forged what German soldiers would come to call Der Russ, the tank that refused to die. By November 1941, the German army had reached the edge of exhaustion. Operation Barbarossa had begun 5 months earlier, with 3.8 million Axis troops sweeping across the Soviet frontier in what was meant to be a campaign of weeks. By winter, those same men were stranded hundreds of kilometers from their supply bases, with broken equipment, no winter uniforms, and an enemy that refused to die. The weather turned against them first. On the Central Front, snow began to fall in mid-October. Within days, the roads of Belarus and Western Russia dissolved into Rasputitsa, the infamous Russian mud season. German Panzer divisions, designed for the hard roads of France, now found their tanks sinking to the fenders. Horse-drawn wagons, which still carried 70% of German supplies, bogged down entirely. Trucks froze overnight, their engines splitting open as water expanded inside the blocks. The Wehrmacht had not issued antifreeze, assuming the campaign would end before winter. Temperatures fell from 0 to -30 degrees Celsius by early December. The Soviet tanks did not stop. The T-34's diesel engine started even in sub-zero weather. Its wide tracks kept it mobile when every German vehicle turned into scrap iron. Reports from Guderian's Panzergruppe II in late November describe Russian tanks moving through terrain inaccessible to ours. German drivers, forced to drain oil from engines every night and heat it over campfires, watched in disbelief as T-34s drove past half-buried Panzers. The contrast was so striking that captured Soviet crews were sometimes interrogated about their winter preparations, as if magic rather than design had kept their machines alive. Mechanically, the difference was straightforward. German Panzer III and IV tanks ran on gasoline, which thickened and evaporated in the cold. Their narrow 36-centimeter tracks concentrated weight on small contact patches, sinking into snow and mud. Their air-cooled engines clogged with ice. By contrast, the T-34's V2 diesel burned slower and cleaner, with low-temperature ignition advantages. Its track width, over 50 centimeters, reduced ground pressure to half that of a Panzer III, and its suspension system, based on Christie coil springs, absorbed shocks that snapped German torsion bars. When the cold set in, it was not just steel, but entire doctrines that froze solid. By December 1941, German tank strength had fallen by 2/3. Army Group Center reported 2,600 tanks operational at the start of the campaign. Only 750 were still running. Many of those could not move more than a few kilometers without mechanical failure. Spare parts were non-existent. Crews cannibalized wrecks for working engines or tracks. Entire panzer battalions became static artillery, firing from fixed positions because their gearboxes had seized. The T-34, by contrast, showed endurance. Despite manufacturing flaws and rushed production, its simplified components allowed repairs in the field. Soviet mechanics could swap a broken transmission in hours using logs as hoists. The human cost was equally severe. By mid-December, German casualties on the Eastern Front exceeded 775,000, nearly a quarter of the invasion force. Frostbite alone accounted for more than 100,000 cases. Food rations shrank to frozen bread and horse meat. Yet Soviet factories east of the Urals were still producing thousands of T-34s each month. The first waves from Nizhny Tagil and Chelyabinsk began arriving just as German fuel ran dry. The weapon that Germany's generals had laughed at as peasant technology was now replacing itself faster than it could be destroyed. In Moscow's defense zone, newly formed Soviet tank brigades, many equipped entirely with T-34s, entered battle for the first time in coordinated formations. Colonel Mikhail Katakov's 1st Guards Tank Brigade became the model for Soviet armored warfare. At Mtsensk in October, Katakov ambushed Guderian's 4th Panzer Division in dense forest, using the T-34's mobility to strike and withdraw before German artillery could respond. Guderian later admitted in his memoirs, "Our Panzer III and IV were helpless against the Russian T-34. We were facing a tank superior in every respect." The situation worsened when the Red Army launched its winter counteroffensive in early December. Reinforcements from Siberia, veteran troops with white camouflage suits, skis, and automatic weapons, arrived near Moscow under General Zhukov's command. They brought with them fresh tanks and artillery. On December 5th, Zhukov ordered the assault. The T-34s led it. German formations that had reached within sight of the Kremlin were driven back 150 to 300 kilometers. Wehrmacht intelligence summaries from that period read like confessions. One report, dated December 12th, stated, "The enemy's new T-34 and KV tanks have demonstrated superiority in armor and mobility. Our 37mm and 50mm guns ineffective." Another, from Panzergruppe 4, recorded that, "Our shells ricochet off the sloping armor of the T-34." Even the famed 88mm flak, redeployed in desperation as an anti-tank weapon, could not be everywhere at once. For every T-34 destroyed by firepower, 2 more replaced it within weeks. Meanwhile, German industry could not adapt fast enough. The upgunned Panzer IV with long 75mm cannon did not reach the front until mid-1942. The Tiger was still in development. Engineers had begun designing the Panther, explicitly modeled after the T-34, but it was a year away from production. For the winter of 1941, the Wehrmacht had no answer. The collapse of mobility destroyed the logic of blitzkrieg. Tanks that could not move were useless. Trucks without fuel could not deliver ammunition. Aircraft grounded by snow could not provide reconnaissance. German divisions that had advanced 600 kilometers in 5 months now struggled to retreat 60 in 1. Frostbitten men wrapped themselves in stolen Soviet coats marked with red stars. The legend of the invincible Wehrmacht, forged in Poland and France, dissolved in the snow outside Moscow. For Soviet tank crews, the winter campaign proved the durability of their machines. Many T-34s still lacked radios, forcing coordination through flag signals or runners, but their ability to fight and survive gave the Red Army confidence it had not known since 1939. Crews learned to dig their tanks into hull-down positions, turning them into armored bunkers. Others mounted logs and spare track links to strengthen weak points. These improvisations, passed through units by word of mouth, created an army that could adapt faster than its enemy could rebuild. When the German High Command met in early 1942 to assess the situation, even the most optimistic officers acknowledged a shift. Field Marshal von Brauchitsch called the T-34 the decisive weapon of the Russian front. Guderian wrote that its appearance caused the heaviest psychological blow to the German armored forces. Hitler himself demanded that future designs incorporate sloped armor, an implicit admission that his enemies had set the new standard. The winter of 1941 did more than freeze engines. It froze illusions. The German army had entered Russia believing it fought an inferior foe, ill-equipped, poorly led, incapable of innovation. What it found was a nation that could build machines perfectly suited to its terrain and war of attrition. The T-34 turned the myth of technological superiority into a liability. Every kilometer of snow the Germans crossed demanded fuel, logistics, and precision they no longer had. The Soviets, fighting on home ground, needed only endurance. By March 1942, when the thaw began, the Wehrmacht had lost the initiative. Its tanks were repaired, its ranks refilled, but its confidence never recovered. The lessons of that winter, simplicity over sophistication, function over form, had been written across the frozen plains by thousands of diesel engines that never stopped turning. The laughter that had greeted reports of Soviet peasant tanks the year before was gone. In its place remained silence, the kind that comes only when men realize that what they mocked has beaten them. The German officers who survived to write memoirs after the war would admit it plainly. The T-34 was the best tank of its time. In the winter of 1941, that truth arrived not as theory, but as sound. The steady rumble of engines moving through snow while theirs refused to start. The war was no longer won on battlefields alone. It shifted into factories, rails, and mobilization plans. In 1941, as the Wehrmacht pushed deep into Soviet territory, one of Stalin's most remarkable responses was industrial evacuation and reconstruction. Between July and November 1941, over 1,500 factories, including whole tank, arms, and machine tool plants, were dismantled and relocated east of the Urals beyond German reach. Factory components, heavy machinery, engineers, and thousands of workers were loaded onto thousands of freight trains and shipped to sites in the Urals, Siberia, and Central Asia. Notably, Kharkiv's tank plant, KHPZ Saks plant number 183, was moved to Nizhny Tagil, becoming the core of the Ural tank factory. The Kirov works, originally based in Leningrad, moved operations to Chelyabinsk, nicknamed Tankograd, and merged workers and machinery with evacuated units. These evacuations were executed under fire, often before the front lines arrived. Many transports ran through damaged rail lines, under air attack, and through snow. During relocation, some factories suspended output entirely. Others operated partial lines at new sites even before full reassembly. The cost was enormous. Lost time, damaged machinery, shortages of power and raw materials, but the Soviets accepted those losses to survive. The result was a transformed industrial geography. By March 1942, output in the eastern regions, east of the Urals, had reached levels equal to what the Soviet Union as a whole produced at the war's start. Coal production in eastern zones more than doubled compared to pre-war. Electricity and steel output rose over 2 times. These regions became the backbone of Soviet war industry. Tank production under this new framework expanded rapidly. The T-34's proven design was well suited for mass manufacture in dispersed factories with varying capacities. The combat vehicle production records show that among Soviet armored fighting vehicles, the T-34 was the most produced type, and continual industrial improvements allowed it to be produced more than any other vehicle in the war. Estimates place total T-34 variants built from 1940 to 1946 at 84,070 units, including T-34 and T-34-85 models, with 35,120 of the 76mm version and 48,950 of the 85mm version. During the war, broader Soviet armored vehicle output was enormous. Some sources estimate that Soviet factories manufactured between 100,000 and 120,000 tanks across all types, light, medium, heavy, over the full conflict. Others estimate that between 1941 and 1945, the Red Army lost some 83,500 tanks, self-propelled guns, and armored vehicles irrecoverably on the Eastern Front. Some of those losses were replaced by production plus Lend-Lease deliveries. In contrast, German armored production lagged behind. According to equipment loss and production tables, in 1942, Germany built about 6,274 tanks, various types, while Soviet output dwarfed that number. The ratio of German to Soviet tank production ranged from about 1 to 1.9 in some years to as much as 1 to 5.8 in 1942. German, Soviet, depending on year. Lend-Lease also contributed, though modestly in tank numbers. By early 1943, Soviet units had around 1,023 Lend-Lease tanks, while total Lend-Lease deliveries since 1941 reached 6,179. WW2 weapons. This supplemented Soviet capacity, but did not replace the core strength built domestically. As production ramped, the Soviets also improved quality control, assembly methods, and standardization. Factories simplified components, reduced parts counts, and introduced automated welding techniques, for example, techniques developed by Professor Evgeny Paton. Wikipedia +3. Wikipedia +3, Wikipedia +3. Some variants of the T-34 were improved over war years, but the doctrine emphasized keeping factories busy, not redesign during crisis. The Germans responded by redesigning their own tanks and attempting to copy features of the T-34, sloped armor, wider tracks. The Panther tank was explicitly influenced by the T-34's design principles. However, German designs were more complex, required more precision, used more scarce materials, and often suffered from mechanical unreliability. Production schedules for heavy German tanks, Tiger, Panther, were slower, parts supply fragile, and maintenance, especially in winter and mud, difficult. During 1943, the Soviets achieved their peak production years. By that point, the Wehrmacht was already strained across multiple fronts. The Soviet industrial push ensured that even when engaged in attritional losses, the Red Army could replace more tanks and renew formations with fresh units. German armored forces struggled to keep up. This industrial war refuted the German pre-war assumption that their superior industry and mechanized doctrine would remain unchallenged. The Germans had underestimated the Soviet Union's capacity for relocation, mass output, and adaptation under fire. Over time, the quantity of T-34s on the front, combined with their mechanical resilience and strategic depth, overwhelmed the prestige of German engineering that had once dismissed them. By the spring of 1942, the myth of German mechanical superiority was gone. What began as arrogance in 1941 had become desperation. On every front, reports from tank commanders told the same story. Their Panzer IIIs and IVs were outgunned, out-armored, and outlasted by the Soviet T-34. Crews called it the ghost tank because its sloped armor made direct hits useless. Engineers back home were ordered to find a countermeasure immediately. In May 1942, Hitler convened an emergency conference at his headquarters in East Prussia to address the Russian tank problem. On the agenda were representatives from the major arms firms, MAN, Daimler-Benz, and Krupp. Guderian's field reports were read aloud. They made clear that the T-34 had set a new standard for tank warfare, 45mm sloped armor, a high-velocity 76.2mm gun, and superior cross-country mobility. Hitler's conclusion was blunt. Germany must build a tank at least equal to, if not better than, the T-34. Two rival design proposals emerged. Daimler-Benz suggested a direct adaptation of the T-34's form: sloped armor, Christie suspension, diesel engine, and a simple silhouette. MAN proposed a more traditional German solution: heavier, mechanically complex, with advanced optics, and a new torsion bar suspension. In January 1943, after months of political maneuvering, Hitler chose the MAN design, largely because it could mount a longer 75mm KWK 42 L70 gun capable of piercing 120mm of armor at 1,000 meters. That gun was the only element Germany could claim as clear superiority. The new tank was designated Panzerkampfwagen 5 Panther. Its conceptual roots, however, came straight from the Soviet steppe. The T-34's sloped armor had demonstrated that angling could provide protection without adding weight. German engineers followed suit. The Panther's frontal armor was 80mm thick and tilted at 55 degrees, mathematically equivalent to more than 140mm of vertical steel. It weighed 45 tons, nearly twice the T-34, and used interleaved road wheels to distribute that weight. Its Maybach HL230 V12 gasoline engine delivered 700 horsepower, giving it a top road speed near 46 kilometers per hour. On paper, it looked unstoppable. In reality, it was a nightmare to produce. The first prototypes appeared only months before the Battle of Kursk in July 1943. There was no time for testing. Under pressure from Hitler, who demanded the Panther join the offensive, the initial batch of 200 tanks went into combat unrefined. Within days, 2/3 broke down without enemy fire. Gearboxes jammed, final drives shattered, and fuel lines ignited under strain. Wartime field reports recorded catastrophic failure rates. In the first week at Kursk, fewer than 40 Panthers remained operational. The problem was not design ignorance, but over-engineering. German manufacturing relied on precision machining and high-grade alloys, standards impossible to maintain under Allied bombing and resource shortages. The Panther required nearly 150,000 labor hours to build. A T-34 required about 3,500. Germany could produce 6 Panthers in the time the USSR turned out 100 T-34s. The quality that once defined the German war machine had become its greatest weakness. Maintenance in the field made things worse. The Panther's suspension, with 16 interleaved wheels per side, clogged with mud and ice. To change one inner wheel, mechanics had to remove half of the others. Its complex engine needed premium fuel, which the collapsing Reich could no longer provide. In autumn 1943, fuel shortages forced training units to simulate movement using wooden mock-ups. A Soviet tank brigade could refuel and return to battle in hours. A German unit could spend days immobilized, waiting for parts that never arrived. Despite these issues, when the Panther worked, it was formidable. Its gun could destroy any Allied tank at long range, and its sloped armor deflected most Soviet rounds. On open terrain, in good weather, a well-handled Panther could outperform everything else on the field. But war in the East was rarely open or dry. Mud, frost, and constant retreat turned mechanical superiority into a liability. German tank crews often had to abandon their vehicles for lack of fuel or repair capability, while Soviet engineers recovered and reused damaged T-34s within days. Industrial desperation bred improvisation. By late 1943, factories introduced simplified models, welded rather than bolted joints, thinner armor in the rear, and reduced electrical systems. Yet even these cost more than Germany could sustain. Allied bombing raids on Leipzig, Kassel, and Nuremberg crippled Panther production lines. By 1944, less than 50% of the tanks shipped from factories reached the front in working condition. Behind the front lines, engineers knew the truth. Wartime memoranda from MAN's design office show mounting frustration. The Panther is overburdened with unnecessary refinement. It cannot be mass-produced under present conditions, but Nazi ideology demanded technical perfection. The concept of a simpler German tank was politically unthinkable. The result was an army fielding fewer, costlier machines against an enemy that embraced simplicity as strength. The Panther was meant to restore German dominance. Instead, it symbolized the collapse of it. It was a copy made with pride too heavy to acknowledge its source. Where the T-34's power came from numbers and adaptability, the Panthers came from theory and precision, qualities that mattered less with every passing month of war. By 1944, Germany had produced roughly 6,000 Panthers, an engineering achievement but a strategic failure. The Soviet Union, in the same period, rolled out more than 30,000 T-34s. For every Panther that broke down, 3 Soviet tanks replaced it on the battlefield. The balance of war had shifted permanently. Even German officers recognized it. After the war, Heinz Guderian wrote, "We tried to equal the T-34 by copying it, and in the process lost the very speed and simplicity that made it superior." The Panther was a monument to engineering brilliance and strategic blindness, a masterpiece in a factory that was burning down. By the summer of 1943, the German army believed one decisive strike could restore its fortune. They called it Operation Citadel, an attack on the Kursk salient, a bulge in the Soviet line that they hoped to cut off and crush. But what waited for them wasn't an open battlefield. It was an engineered trap. For months, Soviet laborers and soldiers had been digging into the steppe, laying over 1 million mines, stringing barbed wire through fields, and building layered defenses so deep that even the most optimistic German planners underestimated what they faced. When the first panzers rolled forward on July 5th, the earth itself exploded beneath them. Panther tanks, the supposed answer to the T-34, began breaking down before they even met the enemy. Engines overheated, transmissions seized, and within days, entire regiments reported that only a fraction of their machines were still moving. German infantry struggled to clear narrow lanes through minefields under constant artillery fire, and by the time armor could advance, the element of speed, the soul of blitzkrieg, was gone. In the north, Model's army gained only a few kilometers. In the south, Hoth's panzers inched toward Prokhorovka, losing time, fuel, and surprise. The decisive clash came on July 12th. The Soviets launched their own counterattack, driving the 5th Guards Tank Army straight into the German line near Prokhorovka. The battle that followed was chaos. Smoke, dust, and short-range duels fought at a few hundred meters. Soviet crews charged through anti-tank ditches and machine gun fire, sometimes ramming Panthers that refused to burn. Losses were staggering on both sides, but the outcome was already sealed. The Germans couldn't advance, and the Soviets had the reserves to keep fighting. When Hitler called off the operation 3 days later, he ended the last German offensive of the Eastern Front. The numbers told the truth more clearly than any speech. Thousands of tanks littered the steppe, many of them German, many abandoned not from battle, but from mechanical collapse. In those same weeks, Soviet factories produced replacements faster than the Wehrmacht could repair its own. The T-34, which had once been mocked as a crude peasant tank, was now the backbone of the most relentless armored army in the world. Kursk wasn't just a lost battle. It was the end of an illusion. After that summer, Germany would never again choose where to fight. After Kursk, the German army lost more than a battle. It lost initiative. The strategic balance shifted permanently. From mid-1943 onward, the Red Army began a relentless westward drive through Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, and the T-34 barreled ahead as its backbone. The Germans, once masters of maneuver, found themselves defending on terrain they once hoped to dominate. Within weeks of the German halt, Soviet forces launched Operation Polkovodets-Rumyantsev toward Kharkov and Belgorod. Units like the 1st and 5th Guards tank armies broke through exhausted German lines, using speed and depth to bypass resistance. The Mirgorod direction offensive, beginning August 3rd, pushed the Wehrmacht south of the Psel River. The Germans could not recover the ground their panzers had gained in weeks. They were forced into reactive posture. Wikipedia. In late 1943 and through 1944, the Soviet war machine tore through occupied lands. At every major junction, the T-34s spearheaded assaults. They crossed the Dnieper in fierce river-crossing operations. They stormed across Ukraine in the summer offensives. As kilometers fell away behind them, German formations retreated, abandoned communications, and left wreckage in every town. The Panther, the Tiger, and the mechanized pride of the Reich found themselves obsolete, not because of firepower, but because they could no longer keep up with momentum. By June 1944, Operation Bagration crushed Army Group Center. A massive Soviet pincer ran east to west, inflicting casualties on German divisions they could not replace. The front collapsed. The Reich's defenses were drawn back to the Vistula. Soviet tank armies rolled through Belarus, liberated Minsk and Brest, and drove into Poland. The T-34, durable and simple, outnumbered and outlasted more complex German tanks. In January 1945, the Red Army launched the Vistula-Oder offensive. In about a month's time, from a line on the Vistula River east of Warsaw, Soviet forces advanced nearly 500 kilometers, reaching the Oder River at the German border. In that push, T-34s smashed through German defense zones at Seelow, skirted fortifications, and massed along the Oder, ready to cross into the Reich. German morale was shredded. Units collapsed under pressure. Cities surrendered rather than fight block by block. When the final push to Berlin began in April 1945, Soviet tank armies swept in from multiple directions. The 2nd Guards Tank Army became one of the first units to enter Berlin proper. Wikipedia streets became minefields. Buildings became strongpoints. T-34s, now upgraded, moved block to block, crushing resistance. The German peasant tank that had once been mocked became the instrument of the Reich's undoing. German officers in memoirs later admitted what they could not say during war. The tank they laughed at became their nightmare. The arrogance with which German generals once dismissed Soviet industry and peasant armies was buried under Berlin rubble as T-34 tracks pressed over broken pavement once intended for triumph. Berlin fell in May 1945. The Reich collapsed not in a grand battle but by exhaustion, outnumbered design, and the sheer weight of Soviet firepower. What Germany had underestimated, the Soviet ability to rebuild, to keep fighting, to produce simple, reliable tanks, had outpaced every boast. The T-34, in its ubiquity and resilience, became the living symbol of a war Germany could not remake in its own image. After the guns fell silent in May 1945, the generals who had once laughed began to write. From exile, captivity, or post-war interrogation rooms, they tried to explain how an army that conquered Europe collapsed before an enemy it once called primitive. In those pages, one word returned again and again: T-34. In the years that followed, Western intelligence officers studied captured tanks and realized what German field commanders had already learned too late. The T-34 wasn't the strongest, nor the fastest, nor the most heavily armored. It was the most balanced. Every piece of it served purpose: sloped armor that deflected shells rather than absorbed them, a 76.2 millimeter gun that could pierce any German tank of 1941, a diesel engine that refused to ignite even when hit, and wide tracks that carried it across snow, mud, and swamp. It was not perfection in power. It was perfection in efficiency. German engineers at MAN and Daimler, who had once mocked its simplicity, studied wrecks and sketches of the T-34 to design their new tanks. The Panther, rushed into production in 1943, borrowed its sloped armor and low silhouette. Yet the very sophistication that made German engineering famous became its downfall. The Panther was faster, deadlier, and far more complicated. It broke down more than it fought. The Soviets, by contrast, could build 3 T-34s in the time it took Germany to assemble one Panther. War is not an engineer's contest. It is a race of endurance. Captured German generals like Heinz Guderian and Erich von Manstein admitted in post-war memoirs that the T-34 had forced a revolution in tank design. Manstein called it the finest tank in the world at that time. Even Western powers took notice. When U.S. and British intelligence teams examined captured Soviet equipment in 1946, they concluded that no single tank design has had greater effect on the outcome of the war. NATO planners would later base much of their early Cold War doctrine on countering mass-produced, medium-weight Soviet tanks modeled on the same concept. The T-34 became the spine of Soviet armored divisions for decades. By 1948, it had already been upgraded to the T-34-85, carrying a heavier 85 mm gun and a larger turret to counter late-war German Tigers. It rolled again in Korea in 1950, facing U.S. Pershings and Shermans, proving that its design still mattered. It fought in the Middle East during the Arab-Israeli Wars, in Vietnam, and across Africa. At one point in the 1960s, more than 40 countries operated variants of the same tank that first shocked the Wehrmacht outside Minsk 20 years earlier. For the Soviet Union, it became more than a weapon. It was memory made of steel. Monuments across Eastern Europe display T-34s perched on stone plinths, their guns pointed west, their paint renewed each year for parades. To millions, it symbolized not the machine itself, but the endurance of those who built it. Farmers, welders, and women working 16-hour shifts in the frozen factories of the Urals. In post-war Germany, the irony was complete. The same commanders who had called the Red Army a rabble were now forced to study the very tank that had buried their empire. The T-34 became a case study in humility, proof that strategy collapses when built on arrogance. Today, historians estimate that more than 57,000 T-34s were produced during the war, more than any other tank model in history. Many still run. Some rust in fields. Others serve as museum relics, their armor dented but their legacy intact. When Western analysts later called it the tank that won the war, they were only half right. It wasn't just the tank. It was the idea behind it, that strength comes from adaptability, that simplicity outlasts sophistication, and that no empire, however proud, can laugh at its enemy forever. When the war ended, Europe was a graveyard of steel. Burned-out tanks lined the roads from the Vistula to the Rhine. Tigers, Panthers, Panzers, once symbols of power, now rusting proof of arrogance. But scattered among them, still running on diesel and determination, were the same T-34s that had started the march years earlier. They were battered, scraped, patched with spare metal, yet they moved. For Germany, the war had begun with laughter. Its generals mocked the Soviet Union as a land of farmers with shovels instead of rifles, and tanks built by men who had never seen a factory floor. That laughter died somewhere in the snow outside Moscow, was buried in the ruins of Kursk, and finally silenced beneath the rubble of Berlin. The T-34 became the sound of that silence, a steady engine hum that carried the weight of every mistake made by those who underestimated it. The Soviet Union built nearly 60,000 of them before the war was over. Each one was proof that the empire of steel could not crush the will of men and women who refused to stop working. The T-34 didn't win because it was the strongest or the most advanced. It won because it was enough to survive, enough to keep moving, enough to remind the world that wars are not decided by pride, but by endurance. After the war, generals from every nation studied it. They called it balanced, revolutionary, a masterpiece of practicality. Even in America, tank designers took notes. The T-34 became the blueprint for the Cold War's armored future, its ghost visible in every tank that followed, from the M26 Pershing to the T-55. Today, a few T-34s still run. They rumble through military parades in Moscow, sit on plinths in Warsaw and Minsk, and sleep under snow in forgotten fields. Rust has claimed their color, but not their story. They belong to no ideology now, only to history. What began as a machine built by peasants ended as a monument to persistence. It buried arrogance, rolled over doubt, and outlived every empire that tried to define its worth. And in the end, it proved something simple, something timeless, that even in the darkest wars, endurance is the last weapon standing.